Welcome to Velvet Chronicles, where every secret changes destiny. Tonight's story begins. He was the coldest duke in London, and he had just fallen for the one woman who owed him nothing and wanted him for even less. Nobody in the ballroom knew that the ruthless Duke of Ravensmere had already signed the marriage papers before the poor companion he'd chosen ever said yes, or that by morning she would vanish into the fog rather than wait to be claimed. She packed her life into a single battered leather valise and slipped out the servant's door before dawn. No tearful goodbyes, no lingering glance at the grand townhouse where she had been nothing but an unpaid servant dressed in second-hand silk. Eleanor Ashworth stepped into the unforgiving London fog believing she had escaped with absolutely nothing to her name. What she didn't know was that Julian Thorne, the Duke of Ravensmere, had already drafted the marriage settlements. He was only waiting to spring the trap. It was 2:30 in the morning when Eleanor finally accepted that her life was entirely meaningless. The realization didn't arrive with a dramatic swell of music or a sudden collapse into tears. It came quietly, in the suffocating heat of the Ashford ballroom, while she knelt on the floor pinning up the torn hem of her cousin's gown. Careful with the needle, Eleanor, Margaret snapped, her voice a reedy whine cutting through the din of 100 waltzing couples. That is Belgian lace. You can't just hack at it. Eleanor didn't look up. Her knees ached against the polished floorboards, her fingers, calloused from years of mending, copying letters, and managing the household ledgers her aunt was too lazy to read, moved with mechanical efficiency. She drove the pin through the heavy silk, narrowly missing her own thumb. It's fixed, Margaret. Try not to let Lord Pelham step on it again. She stood, brushing the dust from her own skirts. Her dress was an offensively dull shade of slate grey, 5 years old, remade twice, designed specifically to make her invisible. It worked perfectly. As Margaret fluttered back onto the dance floor, laughing at some forgettable Viscount's joke, Eleanor retreated to the alcove behind the potted ferns. She was the poor relation, the orphaned niece. She was furniture that occasionally breathed. From across the room, Julian Thorne watched her retreat. The Duke of Ravensmere was not a man given to whims. He was 32, brutally wealthy, and possessed a reputation so deeply rooted in cold, calculating ruthlessness that most débutantes approached him with the terrified reverence usually reserved for wild animals. He hated the season. He despised the desperate, sweating ambition of the ballrooms. Yet for the past 4 weeks he had attended every major event. He was watching the shadows. He was watching her. Julian took a slow sip of scotch, the crystal glass heavy in his hand. He noted the sharp line of Eleanor's jaw, the shadows bruising the skin beneath her eyes, the rigid, exhausted line of her spine. She wasn't beautiful in the way society demanded. She was too sharp, too pale, too guarded. But while the rest of the women in the room performed like trained show ponies, Eleanor Ashworth endured. He'd first noticed her a month earlier, haggling with a fishmonger in the rain while holding an umbrella over her complaining aunt. She'd bartered the man down with a ruthless, dead-eyed pragmatism that Julian found instantly, inexplicably fascinating. Since then he had watched her patch family scandals, manage drunken uncles, and absorb 1,000 petty cruelties without shedding a single tear. She's wasting away here, Julian thought, his jaw tightening. They are draining her to the bone. He set his glass down on a passing tray. It was time. He had gathered enough information, her family's debts, their precarious social standing, exactly how much pressure to apply. He would call on her uncle in the morning. He would make an offer they could not refuse, and by week's end Eleanor would be removed from this parasitic family and installed in his own home as his Duchess. He didn't ask himself whether she would want him. Julian dealt in realities. He was a duke. She was a penniless companion. It was a transaction she would be foolish to reject, and from what he'd observed, Eleanor was never foolish. He took a step forward, intending to cross the room and demand a dance, a final, formal declaration of his intent to the watching crowd. But a sudden commotion near the terrace doors caught his attention. Eleanor's aunt, Lady Pemberton, was standing over the girl, her face flushed with gin and fury. "You lost it!" Lady Pemberton hissed, her voice carrying over the string quartet. A diamond clasp, Eleanor. Do you know what that cost? I did not lose it, Aunt, Eleanor replied, her voice terribly calm, entirely devoid of inflection. You gave it to Margaret to hold, and Margaret left it in the carriage. Do not lie to me. You resent Margaret. You resent us all, after we took you in, clothed you, fed you. The music seemed to falter. Heads turned. The ugly, raw sound of a family's cruelty was spilling onto the pristine ballroom floor. Julian's chest went cold. He began walking toward them, his stride lengthening, his anger sliding from a simmer to a hard, freezing certainty. He would ruin the Pembertons. He would strip them of every copper they owned. Before he could reach them, Eleanor did something that stopped him in his tracks. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply looked at her aunt with a gaze so entirely empty, so completely devoid of care, that it looked like a corpse staring at a wall. You're right, Aunt, Eleanor said softly. You've clothed and fed me. I consider the debt paid in full with my labor. I won't be returning in the carriage with you. Don't be absurd, girl. Get back in the corner. Goodbye, Aunt. Eleanor turned. She didn't run. She walked with agonizing slowness toward the servants' corridor, never looking at the crowd, never looking at Julian, who stood a mere 10 feet away. She pushed through the heavy baize door and vanished. Julian stared at the door. For the first time in his adult life, a flicker of genuine panic flared in his chest. Wait. That wasn't the plan. By the time he shoved through the crowd and pushed open the servants' door, the narrow hallway stood empty. Only the faint scent of rain and cheap lavender soap lingered in the damp air. She was gone. It rained for 3 days after she disappeared. The London streets turned into a slick, filthy mirror of soot and horse dung. Eleanor sat on the edge of a narrow, lumpy mattress in a room that smelled of damp wool and boiled cabbage. The boarding house in Whitechapel charged for pence a night. She had precisely 3 shillings and 2 pence left in her velvet coin purse. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping a thin woolen shawl tightly around her shoulders. Her teeth chattered, a rhythmic, annoying sound in the quiet room. She was hungry, a deep, gnawing cramp sat just beneath her ribs, a stark reminder that pride was an expensive luxury. I have nothing, she thought. The realization wasn't terrifying. It was liberating. For 10 years she had carried the weight of the Pemberton family's crumbling facade. Now the weight was gone. She was untethered. She could starve, yes, but she would starve on her own terms. She'd spent the last 2 days walking until her boots wore thin, answering advertisements in the morning papers, a governess in Marylebone, a lady's maid in Mayfair, a seamstress in Covent Garden. In every house she'd been turned away. She had no references. When asked why she'd left her previous position, she refused to answer. The society matrons looked at her plain grey dress, her unsmiling mouth, her proud chin, and saw a liability. Tomorrow, Eleanor whispered to the cracked ceiling, I'll try the mills. It was a death sentence for a gentleman's daughter, but Eleanor hadn't considered herself a gentleman's daughter since she was 14. Across the city, in a mahogany-panelled library that smelled of leather and expensive cigars, Julian Thorne was methodically tearing a family apart. Lord Pemberton sat across from the Duke's massive desk, sweating profusely into his cravat, looking like a melting candle. Julian sat perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on the older man with the detached curiosity of a surgeon holding a scalpel. I will ask you one final time, Pemberton, Julian said, his voice a low, resonant purr that raised the hairs on the back of the older man's neck. Where did your niece go? Your Grace, I swear on my life, we don't know. The girl is unstable, ungrateful. She packed a single bag and slipped out like a thief in the night. Did she take money? Not a penny. She left the housekeeping funds on the desk, down to the last farthing. Madness. Julian leaned back, steepling his fingers. Not madness, he thought. Pride. She wanted a clean break. She wanted to owe them nothing. It was infuriating. It was magnificent. My solicitors have reviewed your outstanding debts, Lord Pemberton, Julian said softly. You owe £30,000 to various creditors. Your estate in Kent is mortgaged twice. You are, for all intents and purposes, ruined. Pemberton choked. Your Grace, surely. I have bought all of your debt, Julian interrupted, dropping the papers onto the desk with a heavy thud. Every note. I own you, Pemberton. The uncle went violently pale. Why? Because your niece caught my eye. Because I intended to make her my Duchess, and because your wife's grotesque lack of civility chased my future wife into the streets. Julian leaned forward, planting both hands flat on the desk, the mask of polite society slipping to reveal the predator beneath. If she comes to harm, if she freezes, or starves, or is touched by a single drunkard in the gutters of this city, I will not simply call in your debts. I will ruin you so thoroughly your grandchildren will be born in a workhouse. Do we understand each other? Pemberton nodded violently, unable to speak. Get out, Julian whispered. As the door clicked shut behind the trembling man, Julian's man of business, a sharp-eyed clerk named Mr. Wexford, stepped out from the shadows of the alcove. The Bow Street runners have been dispatched, Your Grace. We're checking boarding houses, pawn shops, and employment agencies. A woman matching her description can't stay hidden long. She's clever, Wexford. She won't use her real name. Julian turned to the window, watching rain lash the glass. The city was a sprawling, devouring beast. The thought of Eleanor out there, cold and alone, twisted a physical knot in his gut. He had waited too long. He'd wanted to observe her, to be certain of her character, and his caution had cost him. Find her, Julian said to the glass. Spend whatever it takes. Put a man on every corner from here to the docks. Find her, Wexford. By the fifth day Eleanor was desperate. She'd sold her mother's silver locket, the only thing of value she possessed, for a handful of shillings. She'd skipped 3 meals. Her head felt light, stuffed with wool, the damp cold settling deep into her bones, making every step a slow, aching effort. She sat on a wooden bench in a dingy employment office near St. Bride's, staring blankly at the soot-stained floorboards, when her name was called, or rather, the name she'd given them. Miss Hale. Eleanor blinked, forcing her eyes to focus. A clerk with ink-stained fingers waved a crisp white envelope at her. Message just came round for you. She stood, her knees trembling slightly, and took the letter. The paper was thick and expensive, the wax seal plain, bearing no crest. She broke it open and scanned the neat, elegant script. To Miss Hale, it has come to my attention that you are seeking employment as a companion. I am a widow residing in a quiet home in Belgravia. My health is poor, and I require a sensible woman to manage my household correspondence and read to me. The salary is £60 per annum, with room and board provided immediately. If the terms are agreeable, a carriage waits outside to convey you. Yours, Mrs. Cordelia Ellery. Eleanor stared at the letter. £60 a year was an absurd sum for a companion, double what a governess might expect. A loud, cynical alarm rang in the back of her head. It was too good to be true. It reeked of a trap, perhaps a brothel owner seeking fresh faces, or a desperate scheme to lure young women into servitude. But the cold draught from the office window bit through her shawl, and her stomach rolled with sudden hollow pain. She looked at the clerk. Is the carriage truly outside? Aye, miss. Plain black hackney. Driver paid me £1 just to hand you the note. Eleanor folded the letter. If it was a trap, she would fight her way out. She had survived her aunt. She could survive a London trickster? But she could not survive another night in the freezing room in Whitechapel. She walked out into the dreary afternoon. A black carriage sat at the curb, horses blowing steam into the damp air. The driver tipped his hat but said nothing as he opened the door. Eleanor climbed in, sinking into plush leather seats that smelled of saddle soap and something else, a faint, lingering scent of expensive tobacco and cedarwood. It smelled familiar, though she couldn't place it. As the carriage jolted north toward Belgravia, she closed her eyes and let exhaustion pull her under. 2 miles away, in the Duke of Ravensmere's study, Julian read the brief note handed to him by his footman. "The package is secured and en route to Belgravia." He folded the paper, slipped it into his breast pocket, and let out a long, shuddering breath. For the first time in 5 days, the tight band of panic around his chest loosened. He poured himself a drink, his hand entirely steady. He had not played the hero. He knew Eleanor better than that. Had he ridden into Whitechapel in his crested carriage, offering salvation and a proposal, she would have rejected him out of sheer stubborn pride. Seen it as charity, or worse, pity. She needed to feel she was earning her keep. She needed to feel in control. So he had invented Mrs. Ellery. He'd purchased a respectable townhouse in Belgravia 3 days earlier and staffed it with his most trusted, tight-lipped servants. He'd paid a retired actress to play the frail widow. Eleanor would have a warm bed tonight. She would eat roast beef and drink hot tea. She would rest and heal from the bruises her wretched family had left on her soul. And then, once she was secure, once the hollow look had left her eyes, Julian would visit his aunt, Mrs. Ellery. He would reintroduce himself. He would court her slowly, methodically, backing her into a corner with nothing but undeniable logic and relentless devotion until she realized the only logical place for her was beside him. He walked to the mirror, adjusting his cuffs. His reflection showed a man who looked dangerous, driven, and entirely unrepentant. "You walked away with nothing, Eleanor," he thought, a dark, possessive smile touching the corner of his mouth. "But you walked straight into my hands." Eleanor woke to the smell of burning applewood and roasting bacon. For a long, disorienting moment she simply stared at the ceiling, plastered with intricate scrollwork, vines circling a central rosette. The sheets pulled up to her chin were woven from linen so fine it felt like cool water against her bare shoulders. No damp draft sliced through the window frames. No shouts rose from the street below. She sat up. Her body ached with a deep, bruising soreness that came not from injury but from the sudden absence of tension, her muscles finally realizing they no longer had to brace against the cold. She pushed the blankets aside and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. A thick Persian rug absorbed the chill of the floorboards. On the mahogany washstand sat a pitcher of hot water beside a cake of milled French soap. Eleanor washed, her movements methodical. She did not smile. She did not weep with gratitude. Instead, a cold, hard knot of suspicion began forming in the pit of her stomach. She dressed in her slate-grey gown, brushed out the wrinkles as best she could, and stepped into the hallway. The Belgravia house was impossibly quiet. Not the hollow, echoing quiet of an empty building, but the insulated, muffled silence of immense wealth. Thick carpet swallowed her footsteps. The wainscoting gleamed like a mirror. She found her new employer in the morning room. Mrs. Cordelia Ellery was a woman of indeterminate age, swathed in expensive cashmere shawls, seated in a velvet wingback chair. She had sharp, bright eyes that didn't quite match the trembling frailty of her hands. "Ah, Miss Hale, Mrs. Ellery said, her voice carrying a theatrical waver. "You look rested. Come, sit, eat." Eleanor took the seat opposite the widow. A silver tray was laden with eggs, ham, toast, and hothouse fruit. "You're very generous," Eleanor said carefully, pouring herself tea. "If I may ask, what exactly will my duties entail?" "You mentioned correspondence." "Yes, yes. Letters to my solicitor, managing the household accounts, reading to me in the afternoons. My eyes are failing, you see. I can begin the accounts immediately after breakfast." "There's no rush, my dear." "I prefer to work," Eleanor said flatly. "It's what you're paying me an exorbitant sum to do." Mrs. Ellery blinked, momentarily losing the waver in her voice. "As you wish. The ledgers are in the library." Eleanor spent the next 3 weeks trying to find the flaw in the mirage. She tore through the household accounts with the ruthless efficiency of a tax inspector. What she found only deepened her suspicion. The accounts were a fiction. The math was correct, but the reality they represented was absurd. The butcher's bills were paid in full, in advance, without a single haggled penny. The coal was delivered by the ton, premium grade, yet listed at half the market price. The footman moved with military precision, and the cook prepared meals that rivaled the finest kitchens of Mayfair. This was not the home of a secluded, ailing widow living on a fixed income. This was a fortress masquerading as a cottage. Then there was the library, a magnificent room lined with first editions and bound folios. On her 10th day, Eleanor pulled a volume of philosophy from the highest shelf. As she opened it, a scent drifted from the pages, cedarwood and expensive tobacco. The exact same scent that had lingered in the hackney that brought her here. Eleanor froze, thumb resting on the rough edge of the paper. She closed her eyes, thrusting her memory back to the ballrooms of London. She thought of the men she had observed from the corners, the politicians, the peers, the rakes. A face surfaced from the gloom, a hard jaw, dark, unblinking eyes. A man who watched her with the detached, terrifying intensity of a wolf assessing a tethered lamb. The Duke of Ravensmere. Eleanor shoved the book back onto the shelf. Her pulse thudded in her ears, slow and heavy. She was not rescued. She was captured. The cage was gilded, padded with velvet, and stuffed with roast beef, but it was a cage nonetheless. She walked to the window, looking out over the manicured gardens. She could pack her battered valise and walk out the front door. But to where? The freezing gutters of Whitechapel? The workhouses? No, Eleanor thought, her jaw locking. Let the trap spring. I want to see his face when he realizes I am not a mouse. She did not run. She waited. She drank the rich tea. She ate the hot house grapes and allowed her body to heal. The dark circles beneath her eyes vanished. Her skin lost its translucent, starved pallor. She built her strength back ounce by ounce, preparing for war. The inevitable arrived on a Tuesday. It rained, a sudden, violent summer downpour that turned the sky the color of bruised iron. Eleanor sat in the library at the great oak desk, ostensibly updating the perfectly fictitious household ledgers. The fire was lit. The room was terribly warm. The heavy mahogany doors clicked open. Eleanor did not look up from her inkwell. "Mrs. Dawson, I don't need more tea, thank you." "I'm entirely out of tea, Miss Ashworth," said a low, resonant voice that sent a physical vibration through the floorboards. "But I could offer you an explanation." Eleanor carefully laid down her pen, capped the inkwell, and only then raised her head. Julian Thorne, Duke of Ravensmere, stood inside the doorway, dripping wet. His dark riding coat clung to his broad shoulders, his boots smeared with fresh mud. He looked entirely out of place among the pristine luxury of the room. He looked dangerous. "My name," Eleanor said, her voice dropping into a register of absolute, freezing calm, "is Miss Hale." "Your name is Eleanor Ashworth," Julian corrected smoothly, stepping further into the room, stripping off his leather riding gloves and tossing them onto a side table. "You are 22. You are the orphan daughter of a ruined baronet. For a decade you suffered the profound indignity of serving as a whipping post for the Pemberton family. And for the last 3 weeks you have been living in a house I purchased, eating food I provided, and auditing ledgers I instructed my clerks to falsify." He waited for the explosion, braced himself for tears, for outrage, for slamming doors. Eleanor merely looked at him, leaning back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. "The coal prices in the ledger gave you away," she said flatly. Julian stopped mid-stride. A flicker of genuine surprise crossed his aristocratic features. "The coal prices? No supplier in London sells premium anthracite for 2 shillings a ton. It was a sloppy detail. Furthermore, your widow forgets her limp when she's anxious, and the carriage that brought me here smelled of your tobacco." Eleanor tilted her head, sweeping her gaze over him with clinical detachment. "If you're going to construct a lie, Your Grace, you must respect the intelligence of your captive. It was a terribly executed performance." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Then Julian laughed, a rough, unpracticed sound torn from his throat. He walked to the desk, pulled up a leather wingback chair, and sat directly across from her, leaning forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The scent of rain and cedarwood washed over her. Up close, his sheer physical presence was suffocating. "You knew," he said, eyes gleaming with a strange, dark hunger. "You knew it was a trap, and yet you stayed." "I was starving," Eleanor replied bluntly. "Pride is a luxury for the fed. I calculated that whoever went to the immense trouble and expense of fabricating an entire household merely to ensnare me likely did not intend to murder me in my sleep. So I ate your food and slept in your bed." Julian's gaze dropped briefly to her mouth before snapping back to her eyes. "My bed?" "Figuratively speaking." Eleanor kept her face expressionless, though her heart battered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Why am I here, Your Grace?" "Because you were vanishing," Julian said, the amusement bleeding out of his voice, leaving behind stark, brutal honesty. "I watched you at the Ashford ball. I watched you walk away from the only shelter you had with nothing but the clothes on your back. It was the most magnificently reckless thing I have ever seen. But I know what London does to women without money or protection. I could not allow it. You do not own me." "I own the Pembertons," Julian countered seamlessly. "I bought their debts. They're ruined. They will never touch you again." Eleanor flinched, the first crack in her armor. She hated her aunt, but the sheer, casual destruction this man wielded was terrifying. "You destroyed a family simply because I left them." "I destroyed them because they mistreated what is mine." "I am not yours," she snapped, her voice finally rising, cracking like a whip in the quiet room. "I'm a person, not a ledger entry. You cannot buy my debts and claim ownership of my life." Julian stood slowly and walked around the desk. Eleanor pressed her spine flat against her chair, refusing to shrink away as he loomed over her, planting a hand on the armrest, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. "I have no interest in owning a pet, Eleanor," he whispered, voice dark and rough. "If I wanted a compliant, trembling creature, I could have my pick of the debutantes in Mayfair. I want a partner. I want a woman who can negotiate down a fishmonger, audit a forged ledger, and look a duke in the eye and tell him his lies are sloppy." He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a folded, heavy parchment. He dropped it onto the desk before her. "What is this?" she asked, not touching it. "Marriage settlements." "You're insane." "I'm practical. I require a duchess. You require security, a name, and a fortress the world cannot breach. I'm offering you an alliance." "An alliance requires trust," Eleanor said, her voice shaking slightly, though she cursed herself for the weakness. "You lied to me. You cornered me." "I secured you," Julian corrected gently, reaching out, his knuckles brushing lightly against the tense line of her jaw. The touch sent a jolt of static through her skin. "I secured you because if I'd offered this on the streets of Whitechapel, your stubborn pride would have made you refuse. You needed to rest. You needed to be strong enough to fight me." He stepped back, putting distance between them, though his eyes never left hers. "Read the settlements, Eleanor. I've given you independent control of an estate in Devon. You'll have a quarterly allowance that dwarfs the Pembertons' entire fortune. If you find my presence intolerable, you may live there, and I will never trouble you. But you will be safe." Eleanor looked down at the parchment. Her hands felt numb. For 10 years she had been invisible, a convenience, a ghost haunting the edges of other people's lives. Now this terrifying, powerful man stood before her, offering the world on a silver platter bound with chains of iron logic. "And if I say no," she asked quietly, "will you throw me back into the street?" Julian's face hardened. "Never. You may stay in this house for the rest of your life as Mrs. Ellery's companion. I'll pay your wages. You'll never see me again." He turned toward the door. "I'll return on Thursday," he said, pausing with his hand on the brass knob. "If the documents are unsigned, I'll respect your decision. But Eleanor, he glanced back, I've never lost a negotiation. The door clicked shut. The heavy silence of the house rushed back in, but the air felt charged, altered. Eleanor sat alone in the library, staring at the marriage settlements. She reached out and traced the thick, raised wax seal with her fingers. The Duke was arrogant, ruthless, manipulative. He had architected a cage to catch her. But as the fire's warmth washed over her back and the reality of his offer settled into her mind, Eleanor realized the most terrifying truth of all: she was considering saying yes. By Wednesday evening, Eleanor had read the marriage settlements 14 times. The parchment was thick, the ink a dark iron gall black that seemed to mock her with its permanence. It was a masterpiece of legal entrapment, heavily disguised as breathtaking generosity. Julian Thorne had offered her financial independence, a sprawling estate in Devon, and a title that would make duchesses bow their heads. In exchange, he demanded her absolute legal submission to him as a husband. Eleanor sat by the fire in the Belgravia library, flames casting long, flickering shadows across the wainscoting. She held a pen, the nib hovering over the heavy parchment. She thought of her aunt's sneering face. She thought of the freezing, damp room in Whitechapel, the hunger that had hollowed her bones, the terrifying vast indifference of London. Then she thought of Julian, the dark, unblinking intensity of his stare, the way he had stripped her aunt of power with a flick of his wrist. He was a predator, but he was asking her to rule the pack beside him. Eleanor dipped the pen into the inkwell. She did not sign her name, not yet. First she turned to the third page and drew a neat, brutal line through the clause stipulating the Duke's right to manage the profits of her Devon estate. In the margin, in her precise, sloping hand, she wrote, profits to remain entirely at the discretion of the Duchess. No interference from the Duke's stewards. She turned the page and crossed out a paragraph requiring her residence in London during the season. Residence to be negotiated annually. She added a clause of her own at the bottom of the fifth page, a quarterly budget of £500, entirely separate from household accounts, allocated for charitable or personal investments, unaudited. When she finished, the document was bleeding red ink. Only then did she turn to the final page, smooth the paper flat, and sign Eleanor Ashworth with a steady, unhesitating hand. Thursday arrived with a heavy, suffocating fog pressing against the windows like wet wool. Eleanor did not pace. She sat at the desk, dressed in her impenetrable slate-grey gown, spine ramrod straight. At exactly noon the heavy mahogany doors swung open. Julian didn't knock. He entered carrying the cold air of the street with him, wearing a dark, impeccably tailored coat, his cravat tied with severe precision. He looked less like a man coming to court a woman and more like a general stepping onto a battlefield. He stopped a few feet from the desk, his dark eyes flicking over her face, searching for any sign of retreat. He found none. Well, he asked, his voice quiet but vibrating with a tension that made the hairs on Eleanor's arms stand up. Eleanor picked up the heavy sheaf of parchment and slid it across the polished oak. Julian stepped forward, picked it up, and did not look at the signature page first. He began reading from the beginning. Eleanor watched his face, watched his eyes snag on the first line of red ink, watched his jaw tighten as he read her demand for total financial control over the Devon estate. He flipped the page, his eye scanned her refusal to be bound to London, he read the demand for an unaudited allowance. The silence in the room stretched until it felt brittle enough to snap. Julian lowered the parchment and looked at her. For a terrifying second Eleanor thought she had pushed too far. He was a duke. Men like him did not accept terms, they dictated them. She braced herself for the explosion, for the cold dismissal that would send her back to the gutters. Instead, the corner of Julian's mouth twitched. A small, almost imperceptible movement, but it transformed his face. The hard, calculating mask fractured, revealing a sudden, startling flash of genuine, devastating amusement. He threw his head back and laughed, a rich, dark sound that echoed off the leather-bound books. He tossed the mutilated contract back onto the desk. "You crossed out my steward's authority," Julian said, leaning his hands flat on the desk, bringing his face level with hers. "You demanded £500 a quarter with no oversight. Do you plan to fund a private militia, Eleanor? I plan to never have to ask a man for the price of a carriage fare again, she replied flatly. Do you accept the amendments, Your Grace? Accept them. Julian's eyes burned with a dark, possessive fire. I'm absolutely thrilled by them. I told you I wanted a partner, Eleanor, not a sycophant. He reached into his coat, produced a silver fountain pen, and signed his initials beside every one of her red ink amendments. He flipped to the final page, his eyes resting on her signature, and the tension drained from his shoulders in one long, heavy exhale. He had her. She was his. We marry tomorrow, he stated, capping his pen. Tomorrow? Eleanor's composure slipped for a fraction of a second. That's impossible. The banns? I purchased a special license from the Archbishop 3 days ago. Julian stood straight, adjusting his cuffs. I'm not giving you time to overthink this, and I'm not giving your uncle time to locate you. I have a carriage arriving at 8 in the morning. Wear whatever you like, I don't care if you marry me in that dreadful grey dress. He turned to leave, then paused at the door, glancing back over his shoulder. Actually, wear the grey dress, he murmured, his voice dropping an octave. It suits your utter disdain for everyone around you. It's entirely magnificent. He left before she could formulate a reply. Eleanor sat alone in the library, her heart hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against her ribs. She looked down at the contract bearing both their names. The snare had snapped shut. But looking at her own red ink scrawled aggressively across the Duke's demands, Eleanor realized she was not the prey. She was a co-conspirator. St. Bride's, Mayfair Square, was vast, cold, and entirely empty. There were no flowers, no choir. The great stained glass windows cast long, bruised ribbons of purple and blue light across the dusty stone floor. Eleanor stood before the altar, the scent of old incense and damp stone heavy in her lungs. She had taken Julian at his word. She wore the slate grey dress. She carried no bouquet. Julian stood beside her in stark, terrifying contrast, formal morning dress, dark hair brushed back, his profile looking as if it had been stamped on a Roman coin. He was a man deeply comfortable with power, radiating an aura of absolute control. Yet as the vicar mumbled through the liturgy, Julian's hand, resting lightly beneath her elbow, felt branding hot through her thin sleeve. I, Julian Edward Thorne, he repeated, his voice echoing through the cavernous nave, entirely devoid of the vicar's trembling hesitation, take thee, Eleanor, to be my wedded wife. He turned his head slightly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. He wasn't reciting lines. He was issuing a vow of ownership, a promise of violent protection. To have and to hold, he continued, the timbre of his voice vibrating in the quiet church, from this day forward. When it was her turn, Eleanor kept her voice perfectly level. She did not tremble. She spoke the words with the crisp efficiency of a ledger entry, though her stomach was tied in knots. She was committing herself to a man who had manipulated her life like pieces on a chessboard. But as he slid the heavy gold band onto her finger, a ring entirely devoid of jewels, solid and impossibly heavy, a strange, unbidden sense of security washed over her. It was done. 30 minutes later the grand, crested carriage of the Duke of Ravensmere pulled up to the wrought-iron gates of Ravensmere House in Mayfair. Eleanor stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The house was a fortress of white Portland stone, boasting an imposing portico and windows that stared down at the street like judgmental eyes. It was 10 times the size of the Pemberton estate. Inside, the grand entrance hall was lined with 30 servants standing in rigid, terrified silence. At their head stood Mr. Whitfield, a butler with the posture of a retired colonel, and Mrs. Dawson, a housekeeper whose pinched face and cold eyes spoke of a woman who ruled her domain with an iron fist. Julian led Eleanor into the hall. The doors boomed shut behind them, cutting off the noise of the London street. Staff, Julian said, his voice carrying effortlessly, may I present Her Grace, the Duchess of Ravensmere. A collective, synchronized bow and curtsy rippled down the line. Mrs. Dawson rose, her pale eye sweeping over Eleanor, taking in the plain grey dress, the lack of a lady's maid, the absence of jewels. She saw a poor, frightened girl who had somehow tricked a duke into marriage. She saw weakness. "Welcome to Ravensmere House, Your Grace," Mrs. Dawson said, her tone perfectly polite yet completely devoid of respect. "I've prepared the rose room for you. I assume you'll want to rest. I shall manage the dinner menus as usual." Julian stood back, leaning against a marble pillar, arms crossed over his chest. He said nothing. He was watching Eleanor. Eleanor looked at the housekeeper. For a decade she had managed a bankrupt, chaotic household held together by spit, twine, and her own sleepless nights. She had dealt with drunken cooks, thieving footmen, and butchers who refused to extend credit. She knew exactly how a house operated, and exactly how a usurper sounded. Eleanor did not raise her voice. She stepped forward, her flat, deadpan gaze pinning Mrs. Dawson in place. "You will not manage the dinner menus as usual, Mrs. Dawson. You will bring the menus, along with the weekly household ledgers, the butcher's receipts, and the wine cellar inventory to my sitting room in exactly 1 hour." Mrs. Dawson blinked, taken aback. "Your Grace, surely the ledgers." "You will also turn over the master set of household keys," Eleanor interrupted smoothly. "I noted dust on the wainscoting in the drawing room as we entered. The footman nearest the door has a frayed collar, and this hall smells faintly of boiled cabbage, which means the kitchen drafts are improperly vented. You've grown complacent." A shocked, suffocating silence fell over the hall. The butler stared straight ahead, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. "I do not tolerate complacency," Eleanor finished. 1 hour, Mrs. Dawson. Do not be late." Eleanor turned away from the stunned staff and looked at Julian. The Duke was still leaning against the marble pillar, his face perfectly composed, but his eyes were entirely black, blown wide with raw, visceral fascination. A slow, deeply predatory smile spread across his face. He pushed off the pillar and walked toward her. "Whitfield," Julian murmured as he passed the paralyzed butler, "show her Grace to the master suite. The rose room won't be necessary." He stopped beside Eleanor, leaning down so his mouth was a fraction of an inch from her ear, the scent of cedarwood enveloping her. "I bought you a house," he whispered, breath warm against her skin, "and you've conquered it in exactly 4 minutes. You are terrifying, Eleanor." "I'm pragmatic," she corrected, refusing to lean away, though a shiver traced down her spine. "I will not live in a house where the servants think they can manage me. They will never manage you." His eyes locked onto hers, heavy with a promise that had nothing to do with household ledgers. "I'm beginning to wonder if I'll be able to manage you." "You won't," she said simply. Julian laughed softly, a low, rumbling sound that settled deep in her stomach. "Good." He stepped back, gesturing toward the grand staircase. "Your empire awaits, Duchess." Eleanor placed her hand on the cold mahogany rail and began to climb. She had walked into the fog with nothing. Now she wore a gold ring heavier than iron, and she walked the halls of a fortress. She did not know if she was a prisoner or a queen, but as she felt the Duke's eyes heavy on her back with every step, she knew one thing for certain: she was never going to be invisible again. Within 3 weeks, Ravensmere House did not merely run, it hummed with the terrifying, lethal precision of a warship. Eleanor did not scream. She did not throw porcelain vases. She simply walked the halls, a silent, watchful phantom in dark plum silk, her ledger tucked under her arm. Her authority was absolute, built on a foundation of unblinking scrutiny. Mrs. Dawson, once the tyrannical housekeeper, now trembled whenever a bell chimed in the study. Eleanor had summoned the woman on her second day and handed her a meticulously drafted list: vendor audits, all butcher, grocer, and coal merchant accounts submitted every Thursday by noon, no exceptions, wastage. The kitchen's excess allowance slashed by 40%, any missing silver docked directly from senior staff wages, ventilation, the offending kitchen draft sealed, the boiled cabbage scent eradicated. The staff quickly learned that the new Duchess possessed the eyesight of a hawk and the mercy of an executioner. But they also learned she was fair. When a scullery maid broke a priceless Ming vase, Eleanor did not dismiss her. She deducted a single penny from the girl's wages to make a point, then had the vase glued back together to catch fireplace spills. Julian watched this transformation with intense, burning fascination. He had expected her to adapt. He had not expected her to conquer. They moved around each other in the massive house like two apex predators sharing a territory, wary, respectful, endlessly curious. They took their dinners together at the long mahogany table, discussing politics, estate yields, and the fluctuating price of consoles. It was a marriage built on cold, hard intellect. But the outside world was not content to leave them in peace. News of the Duke of Ravensmere's sudden, secret marriage to a penniless companion exploded through Mayfair like a gunpowder keg. The gossip sharpened its claws, and inevitably, the ghosts of Eleanor's past came knocking. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Mr. Whitfield entered Eleanor's private sitting room, his expression pinched. "Your Grace, Lady Pemberton, and Miss Margaret Pemberton are in the front hall. They insist upon an audience." Eleanor did not look up from the letter she was writing. Her hand did not tremble. The ink flowed smoothly across the page. "Did they bring their calling cards, Whitfield?" "They did not, Your Grace. Lady Pemberton states she needs no card to see her own niece." Eleanor carefully placed her pen in the silver holder. The silence in the room was absolute. For 10 years, the very mention of her aunt's name would have sent a spike of cold panic straight into her marrow. She sat perfectly still, waiting for the familiar terror to arrive. It did not come. Instead, a profound, icy boredom settled over her. "Show them into the rose drawing room, Whitfield," Eleanor said calmly. "Serve them the second best tea. Do not offer biscuits." When Eleanor descended the stairs 15 minutes later, she found her aunt and cousin pacing the length of the Persian rug. The rose drawing room was a masterpiece of intimidation, decorated in heavy silk damask and gilded mirrors that reflected their shabby, desperate anxiety back at them. Lady Pemberton turned as the doors opened, wearing a pelisse 2 seasons out of fashion, her face heavily powdered to hide the toll of her husband's financial ruin. Margaret stood behind her, clutching a reticule, her eyes wide with toxic, naked envy as she took in Eleanor's heavy silk gown and the intricate pearl styling of her hair. "Eleanor!" Lady Pemberton cried, forcing a horrific, stretching smile onto her face, taking a step forward with arms outstretched. "My dearest darling girl, we've been sick with worry. To leave without a word, and then to hear you were swept up by the Duke." "Aunt," Eleanor said. She did not raise her voice. She did not move forward. She stood just inside the doorway, hands clasped loosely before her. The single word hit Lady Pemberton like a physical blow. The older woman dropped her arms, her fake smile faltering. "Well," she stammered, "I see you've done very well for yourself, though I must say Julian's methods were quite brutal. He bought your uncle's debts. He's calling them in. We're to be turned out of the Kent estate next week, Eleanor. We'll have nothing." "An unfortunate consequence of living beyond your means," Eleanor replied, voice completely devoid of inflection. "You little viper!" Margaret burst out, her face flushing an ugly, mottled red. "You planned this. You threw yourself at him at the Ashford ball, didn't you? You ruined us on purpose." Eleanor looked at her cousin, remembering kneeling on the floor pinning the hem of Margaret's dress, her knees aching, fingers bleeding. The dismissive sneers, the cold tea left for her in the kitchen, the grinding humiliation of being invisible. "If I had the power to ruin you, Margaret," Eleanor said softly, "I would have done it 5 years ago." Lady Pemberton stepped in front of her daughter, eyes narrowing into desperate slits. "Listen to me, Eleanor. You owe us. We took you in. If it weren't for my charity, you'd have died in the gutter. You must speak to the Duke. You must make him forgive the debts. He'll listen to you. I owe you nothing." Eleanor's voice finally dropped an octave, the temperature in the room plummeting. "I paid for my keep with a decade of unpaid labor. I managed your ledgers, mended your clothes, and swallowed your cruelties. The ledger is balanced, aunt. The debt is settled. You cannot turn us away. We are family. Lady Pemberton's voice cracked into a shrill, panic-stricken screech. Whitfield, Eleanor said. The butler, who had been standing silently in the hallway, stepped into the doorway instantly. Your Grace? My aunt and cousin were just leaving. Please see them to the door. If they return, instruct the footman to bar their entry. Lady Pemberton gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. Margaret burst into loud, theatrical tears, but Eleanor had already turned her back. She walked out of the room, spine rigid, chin high, never looking back as Whitfield escorted the weeping, shouting women into the cold London street. When Eleanor reached the top of the stairs, she stopped. Her lungs felt tight. A fine tremor began in her hands. She gripped the mahogany banister, closing her eyes, focusing on the slow, heavy rhythm of her breathing. A shadow fell over her. Julian materialized from the gloom of the upper gallery. He had been standing there, hidden in the alcove, watching the entire exchange. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't offer hollow comfort. He simply stepped up behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest, though he did not touch her. They asked for mercy, Julian murmured, his voice a dark rumble against her ear. Mercy is a luxury for the secure, Eleanor whispered, opening her eyes. They would have stripped me to the bone if they'd had the chance. I know. Julian raised his hand, his knuckles brushing lightly, almost hesitantly, against the nape of her neck, a shockingly tender gesture from a man who dealt in ruin and leverage. You are a terrifying creature, Eleanor. You built the cage, Your Grace. No, Julian corrected, turning her gently to face him, his eyes entirely unmasked, stripped of their usual cynical armor. I opened the door. You built the empire. That evening the great house settled into a heavy, unbroken silence. Eleanor sat in the library staring into the roaring hearth. The ledger lay open on her lap, but the numbers blurred together. The encounter with her aunt had left a strange, hollow ache in her chest. She had won. She was safe, heavily fortified behind walls of stone and money. Yet the phantom of the invisible, worthless girl still hovered in the corners of her mind, waiting for the illusion to shatter. The door clicked open. Julian walked in carrying 2 crystal glasses and a heavy crystal decanter of scotch. He wore no cravat, his linen shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, making him look less like a duke and more like the dangerous, ruthless man who had hunted her through the streets of London. He set a glass on the side table beside her chair and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid. Drink, he ordered softly. Eleanor took the glass. The scotch burned her throat, a sharp, clean fire that chased away the lingering cold in her chest. Julian sat in the wingback chair opposite her, mirroring the exact position they'd taken weeks earlier in Belgravia when he had first laid his trap. You look troubled, Duchess, Julian observed, his dark eyes locked onto her face. I'm merely calculating, Eleanor lied. Liar. Julian took a slow sip of his drink. You're wondering when the bill comes due. You're waiting for the trap to spring shut, for me to demand the price of all this security. Eleanor's grip on her glass tightened. Every transaction has a cost. You gave me an estate, a title, the power to crush my enemies. You signed away your financial control. What do you want from me, Julian? It was the first time she'd used his Christian name. The word hung in the air between them, intimate and dangerous. Julian set his glass down and leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. When I saw you at the Ashford ball, he began, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly register, I didn't see a victim. I saw a survivor. I saw a woman who looked at the bloated, hypocritical circus of London society with the exact same disgust that I felt. He looked down at his hands, a muscle feathering in his jaw. For a man who controlled everything he touched, he suddenly looked remarkably vulnerable. I was suffocating, Eleanor, he confessed quietly. My entire life has been a series of calculated maneuvers. I'm surrounded by sycophants, liars, people who see only my title. I built this empire, and I realized I was going to die in it alone. He looked up, his gaze piercing through her defenses, dismantling the heavy iron wall she'd spent 10 years constructing. I didn't corner you to own you, Julian said, voice raw with a truth he had never spoken aloud. I cornered you because I recognized you. I saw my own isolation in your eyes. I wanted you to fight me. I wanted you to demand more, to bleed my contracts with red ink, because I needed to know that someone in this godforsaken world possessed the strength to stand beside me without breaking. Eleanor stared at him, the breath trapped in her lungs. You asked what I want from you, Julian said. He stood, crossed the short distance between them, and knelt on the thick rug in front of her chair, an act of profound, deliberate surrender from a man who bowed to no one. He reached up, taking the heavy glass from her trembling fingers and setting it aside, then took her hands in his. His palms were warm, calloused from riding, anchoring her to the present. I don't want your gratitude, Eleanor, he whispered, looking up into her face. I don't want your submission. I want your trust. I want the only thing you've never given to anyone. Eleanor looked down at the man kneeling before her, the Duke of Ravensmere, a predator who had turned himself into a shield for her sake. The cynical voice in her head, the one that had kept her alive through a decade of neglect, screamed at her to pull away, told her it was a trick. But as she looked into Julian's dark, unblinking eyes, she saw the absolute, terrifying sincerity there. She let out a long, shuddering breath. The iron around her heart, forged in the freezing gutters of Whitechapel and the cruel ballrooms of Mayfair, finally began to melt. She slipped her hands from his grip, only to reach up and frame his face, her thumbs tracing the hard line of his jaw. My trust is a heavy burden, Julian, she warned softly, her voice thick with unshed emotion. I have broad shoulders, he replied, turning his face to press a fierce, branding kiss into the palm of her hand. Julian stood, pulling her up with him. He didn't hesitate this time. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. Eleanor didn't stiffen. She let her head fall against his shoulder, burying her face in the curve of his neck, breathing in the scent of cedarwood and rain. She closed her eyes, listening to the steady, powerful rhythm of his heartbeat beneath his shirt. She had walked away with nothing. She had expected to freeze in the dark. Instead, she had walked blindly into the arms of a man who had built a fire specifically to keep her warm. I am here, Eleanor whispered into his skin, an admission of surrender, a vow of partnership. I am not running. Julian's arms tightened around her like a vice, holding her as if she were the only real thing in his world. Neither am I, Duchess. Neither am I. Survival in a cruel world often demands a heart of iron, but true power lies in knowing when to finally let that iron melt. Eleanor and Julian did not build a fairy tale. They built an empire of mutual respect and absolute, terrifying devotion, proof that sometimes the ultimate act of rebellion isn't walking away with nothing. It's taking everything you are owed.